Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Arken EP-8. But before we get into the video, full disclosure is that quite a while ago, Arken reached out to me asking if I wanted to do a review on their products. Usually I'm fine with working with companies in terms of getting free product in exchange for a review. That's usually not a problem, but it really doesn't stop there with Arken. They, in my opinion, work a little bit too closely with a lot of content creators because they also offer scopes for giveaway, ammo, and other things as well. I'll let your imagination fill that out. But I said no to everything else other than the scope. After I said no to the rest of their offers, essentially they ghosted me and never got back to me, which is perfectly fine. They probably looked into me a little bit more and were like, we probably shouldn't send this guy a scope. So then you might be asking, how do I have this Arken EP-8 in for review? Well, the kind gentleman at RTT Guns and Gear, he actually sent me his so that I could do this review on it. So I didn't pay for this optic. RTT Guns and Gear sent it to me, and I have no relationship with Arken whatsoever. Before we get going into the basics of this scope, go ahead and comment literally anything down below, because I haven't done that in a while. The EP-8 is a 1:8 by 28 first focal plane LPVO. Now that 28mm objective means that we are working with a 34mm main tube. In terms of length, it's about 10.5 inches long, which is very average. In terms of weight, I believe it's right at 21 ounces, which is actually pretty good for a scope with a 34mm main tube. You can very easily get into the 23, 24, 25 plus ounce range when you get into these chunkier scopes. The EP-8 used to feature capped windage and elevation. On the left-hand side of the body, we have our illumination dial, which has 12 total settings. You have an off, 9 daylight settings, 2 night vision settings. Night vision settings on an LPVO are technically useful for a few people out there, though it's always kind of optimistic. Though again, you don't need 11 daylight settings, so having night vision settings for a couple people might make them happy. Moving back, we have our magnification ring, which has good knurling on it, as well as an included throw lever, which is quite nice. In terms of the throw, it's a 180-degree throw, and it's fairly smooth, indicative of a optic in this kind of medium price range. These used to be about $350, and then they bumped the price up to $500. Now they're currently on sale for 25% off, so they're back down around $380. So they're certainly not expensive scopes by any means, but they're maybe just like one small step above a budget scope. At the back of the scope, we have the diopter for adjusting the reticle to your eyes. Everybody's eyes are a little bit different, so you want to make sure that that reticle is as clear to you as it can be. Now, getting into the usability of the scope, that's going to be our field of view, eye relief, eye box, that sort of stuff. Getting into the eye relief, at 1x, like most LPVOs, you have a very forgiving forward and back of about anywhere from 3 to 8 inches will give you a usable sight picture. And then as you move up the magnification ring, as that exit pupil decreases, of course, with this 34mm main tube, 28mm objective, it does get pretty tight. At the top end, you have a optimal eye relief of about 3.5 to 3 3/4 inches or so, but it is still usable in terms of the eye box, which is your up, down, left, and right. So as far as LPVOs go, it is very usable in terms of the eye relief and eye box. Now moving on to field of view, which is how much do you actually see through the optic. It is rated for 121 feet at 1x at 100 yards. My scale is anything above 100 is good, 110 very good, 120 plus is into phenomenal top tier territory. Pause for just a second. I think Arken is overestimating their field of view at 1x, at least compared to some other optics. Maybe those other optics are estimating their field of view, but for 120 feet, it seems to be a little bit smaller than that when compared side to side with other optics with similar field of views. Not only is that nice at 1x to have a big picture, but of course as you increase through the magnification range, where you really want that additional information, that's why you're buying a magnified optic in the first place, it gives you more information at all of those different magnification levels. Now getting into the reticle, they call this the KYS compromise box, or something like that. Starting out in the center, we have a floating dot and a outer horseshoe to kind of draw your eye to the center. This is mostly good. At 1x, the outer horseshoe is thick enough to still show up at 1x magnification. When the reticle is very small, you still need something to aim with, and that very thick horseshoe does pick up very well at 1x, which is great for a first focal plane reticle. The problem is at, say, let's say 8x magnification, it's really close to the center dot, which is good at 1x, and the size is good at 1x. But again, as we now are at 8x magnification, it can start to obscure a lot around our target. Now, this is going to depend greatly on your target size and distance. For instance, if you have, let's say, a 6-inch target at 200 or 300 yards, or maybe even, let's say, a mid-sized target or a partially occluded target, something like that, that horseshoe can occlude a lot of information and kind of block your visibility. Now, the center dot is very precise. That is great. And of course, if you're at, say, extended distances, 300, 400, 500, 600 yards, or even further in some cases, that outer horseshoe isn't really going to be an issue. But just know that there were a few circumstances where I was shooting at kind of an intermediate distance at a high magnification, and that outer horseshoe was blocking just a little bit more than I would like. Now, of course, at 1x, you have the EOTech-like Donut of Death, which does work very well to kind of give you a fast acquisition sight picture. If you're inside about 10 yards or so, shooting at a full-size target, you can just put that on the target and pull the trigger, and in theory, you'll get an acceptable hit. Really, for me, it's more about just picking up the reticle quickly. If I'm moving, transitioning, pulling up the rifle from, let's say, a high ready, I can see that Donut of Death faster than I can see the very small but usable center aiming point. Again, though, as we dial up the magnification, let's say between 3 and 6, it does become quite large in the glass and takes up some space. It's not the worst thing. There is plenty of space between it and the actual reticle itself in the center to give you enough gap, but it is very noticeable between, again, about 3 and 6x magnification before it finally gets out of your image at 8x. Now, getting into the BDC, the center floating dot is meant to be your 50 200 yard zero, again with 5.56 and probably some other calibers as well, though again, that always depends on what ammunition you're shooting, what barrel length, so on and so forth. So for your specific application, you are going to have to zero it and true it for you. But in general, this is going to be the reference points out to about 800 yards. So with our 50 200 zero at the center point, we then have a frame and fire system throughout the ladder in the center of the reticle, and this is where it gets a little bit cluttered and causes us some other issues that we'll get into in just a minute. So essentially what you have is torso and shoulder ranging at all of your appropriate distances out to 400 and 800 yards. So the average human shoulder width, which is about 18 inches or so, and then of course the average torso height as well. There's also a 9-inch head approximation that you can use between the 400 drop dot and shoulder ranging, which is niche, but it technically could still possibly be usable. Now, the issues that we're gonna have here is that it is a little bit cluttered. This is very difficult to get right, and they are trying to give you as much information as possible to make it as easy to, again, frame and fire. If you can see their shoulder width or their height, you can approximate and then take that shot. So in theory, this can be a very effective system. The problem here is that because we have the torso ranging right off to the side of our drop dots, we're now losing our 5-mile-an-hour wind holds. So instead of that, we have only 7-mile-an-hour wind holds. Now, where I'm shooting out in South Dakota, I have very variable winds. So anything from 5 miles an hour, 0 miles an hour, all the way out to 20 at times where I'm shooting. Now, I greatly prefer the system that a lot of other BDC reticles implement, which is both 5 and 10 mile an hour full value winds, which gives you the best of both worlds, essentially, between a light to a medium amount of wind. That works very well for me personally and allows me to use the reticle much more effectively. With the Killbox reticle, you have 7 mile an hour winds, which is a compromise. They almost never align close enough to be usable, so a lot of the times they might as well not be there. Now, there's not really a simple solution to this problem, and first focal plane reticles, especially on LPVOs, are very complicated. You're trying to get as much capability as possible in a very small, compact area with a high level of precision while still maintaining usability. So I do understand that this is very complicated. Now, what I would do instead is lose the 400-yard torso ranging, move everything to the center line with the appropriate hashes for the BDC, drop the 7-mile-an-hour wind holds and replace those with 5 and 10-mile-an-hour winds, and probably lose a little bit of the outer horseshoe so that you can get a little bit better sight picture at, again, some intermediate distances. For me and how I like to use reticles, this would simplify, clarify, and add a little bit of capability, especially in winds. You do also have mover holds for people moving left to right, and I have no complaints about those whatsoever. With the BDC, I did use it all the way out to 600 yards with no issues, and as far as the ranging goes, I use it on 14.5-inch 5.56, 14.5-inch 6.5 Creedmoor, and probably one other setup in there as well, and it always worked perfectly fine. Now, on top of that, I did also take it with just 8x magnification all the way out to 930 yards with the previously mentioned 14.5-inch 6.5 Creedmoor, and while that was technically theoretically doable, wasn't really what I would consider to be fun. I ended up having to dial quite a bit with the scope so that I could kind of walk it into the point where I could use the BDC at, again, those extended ranges with a short barrel 6.5 Creedmoor. It was technically doable, though, outside of the parameters of the scope, so I really don't blame the scope whatsoever for those extended range shooting. Now let's go ahead and talk about the biggest selling point of the Arken EP-8, and that is going to be the glass quality. Now, the glass itself is Japanese glass, even though the body and all of the internals are made in China. Now, when most people think of Japanese glass, you might be thinking Trijicon LPVOs, you might be thinking Vortex razors, or any number of fantastic looking optics. Unfortunately, Japanese glass doesn't really mean anything on its own. There are several glass manufacturers in all of these countries, the Philippines, Japan, and of course China as well, and probably a few others out there. Germany is another one top-tier glass manufacturer. However, there's such a wide variance in performance that just saying Japanese glass doesn't really mean anything. For instance, the manufacturing process of the glass itself, coatings, prescriptions, and a wide variety of other things come into play, so you can't just say Japanese glass. If so facto, it's better than Chinese glass that you'll find on a lot of cheaper optics and some more expensive optics as well. Unfortunately, that's just not the case anymore, and that is one of my complaints about the Arken EP-8, is not that the glass quality in terms of real-world use is bad, but if you compare it against what people say it is or some of their marketing, it does not live up to the hype. Now, I know there are some channels out there that don't do comparison reviews because they like to look at a product in a vacuum and not try and muddy the waters. But I do comparison reviews, so let's go ahead and talk about what does good glass actually mean. Is it good compared to a Vortex Razor HD? No. Is it good compared to the PLXC from Primary Arms? No. Is it good compared to a host of other high-end optics? No. Is it good compared to a Happy Meals magnifying glass? Yeah, it's fantastic when you compare it against that. So in terms of its relationship and how it stacks up against other high-end glass, it is very middle of the road. Now, to stratify this with some other LPVOs that you're probably familiar with, starting off with the probably best, well, I should say second best, budget LPVO on the market, that is the SIG MSR 1-6. The Arken EP-8 is a step above that in terms of clarity, the way the image presents itself, color, brightness, and clarity, especially at the higher magnification levels between, say, 6 and 8. You get much higher levels of clarity than you'll get with something like the SIG MSR 1-6, which is about a $250 optic and does get a little bit murky at the higher magnification levels. If you compare this against a lot of the older budget LPVOs, the Strike Eagle 1-6 and 1-8 Gen 2s, not the newer ones, the SIG MSR 1-6, probably some of the Arrowheads as well from Swamp Fox, and probably a few other older style LPVOs that are kind of a generation back at this point, it does look like a step up compared to some of those other cheaper LPVOs, which you would hope for its increased price. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes from when people say that the Arken EP-8 looks so good, is that a lot of them are probably coming from cheaper budget, a little bit older LPVOs, and then they look at the Arken EP-8 and it is a step up in terms of performance, and they say, wow, this looks fantastic. Now again, it doesn't even compete with like the older Vortex Viper PST Gen 2 1-6 LPVO. That glass looks much better than the Arken EP-8. Now, unfortunately for the EP-8, I've been using it side by side for the last 2 months or so with a new offering from Vortex that is significantly cheaper and has better glass and is made in China. That is the Vortex Venom 1-6, which I currently think is the best budget LPVO on the market. If you're spending less than $500 or $600 on an LPVO and you're fine with second focal plane, the Vortex Venom for about 250 bucks is the best LPVO on the market if you're on a budget, and that's going to be next week's video. Spoiler alert. So to compare the glass on the Vortex Venom versus the EP-8, again $250 versus about $380 to $500 respectively, the Vortex Venom's image is noticeably brighter. It has punchier colors, better contrast, it looks better. On top of that, it also has a larger field of view, which is noticeable. It is a fantastically performing scope for such a inexpensive option, and that's because Vortex is very, very good at making scopes. They've been in this game for a long time, and their new geometry, their new prescription in the Vortex Venom 1-6, even though it is a cheap Chinese-made optic, is fantastic. Now, it's not just a wholesale win for the Vortex Venom. One thing that I will say about the EP-8 with its ED glass is it does have less chromatic aberration. For instance, the Vortex Venom at extremely bright points in the image, like sunlight reflecting off of a car window or a painted steel target or something like that, you can have a tiny bit of chromatic aberration, essentially color shift. It'll shift to a pinkish color, whereas the darker glass in the EP-8, just by proxy of its ED nature, has less chromatic aberration, and if I had to rate the edge-to-edge clarity, I would say it has a slight edge over the Vortex Venom, which does have a little bit of fisheye with that monstrous field of view. Now, please don't take away from this that I'm saying the Arken EP-8's glass is bad. It is not as good as other high-end scopes utilizing Japanese glass, so don't just get sold on the fact that it says made in Japan glass on the box, even though, again, the rest of the optic is made in China. Now let's go ahead and talk about durability of the Arken EP-8. Keep in mind, I've been using this for about 2 months now. I've probably put somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 rounds on it, mostly 5.56, though some 6.5 Creedmoor as well. Now, a word on durability testing, and this might sound surprising coming from me, but I don't put all that much stock in certain durability testing. After a certain point, I don't really think it matters at that point. It just becomes destructive testing and entertainment, which is perfectly fine to provide to find failure points in optics and whatnot. But for my own personal use, I like to have a certain level of confidence in an optic, and we like to see trends arising in certain platforms, but it's all anecdotal at the end of the day to this specific optic and this specific mount on this specific gun that I did the drops on. Now, getting into how I do durability testing, I do a singular shoulder height drops onto a sort of, let's say, medium surface, which is usually dirt and rocks. At that point in an LPVO, almost every single one I've ever tested, minus one, has survived, and most of them survive with little or no point of impact shift, and that is what I am personally looking for in an LPVO with a decent mount. Fortunately for this EP-8 in this mount, which is their Arken mount, everything is torqued down to spec, it had little to no point of impact shift at 50 yards after a shoulder height drop onto, again, dirt and rocks. Now, the next drop that I perform is onto a harder medium, let's say either concrete in this case, or usually an AR500 steel plate. Now, the problem with this one after that shoulder height drop is that, of course, the elevation cap took most of the impact, which is actually good. It crumpled, didn't damage the turret whatsoever, so it's kind of sacrificial in that way, and that's why they're capped. But unfortunately for the Arken EP-8, the entire mount bent down, which you might be able to tell. It's at like a 50 MOA cant or something like that. It is technically still usable. From what I can tell currently, the optic itself isn't bent, but the actual mount, the cantilever section up front, which is thin, but not the thinnest section that I've seen, did bend. Now, if I were to redo this testing, I would probably put it in a worn mount, which has a little bit thicker of a cross section on the actual cantilever section, so less likely to bend in this way. And if Arken was going to update a little bit, I would just put a little bit more material or add a little bit back into the cantilever section so that it doesn't bend. Now, keep in mind that even though the mount failed and the elevation cap is broken, the optic is still 100% fully functional. It doesn't have any sort of issues with the glass inside. Nothing shifted in that regard to where parallax shifted or it came off the rails or something like that. It is a still fully operational, fully functional scope. Illumination still works, windage and elevation still works. So as soon as I put this in another mount, it will be good to go and will probably end up given away on my subscribe star. So again, what I'm personally looking for in an LPVO is that it survives the shoulder height drop onto dirt and rocks without a major point of impact shift. Again, the only LPVO, I think the only LPVO that I've had fail that is the Athlon 1-10 by 28. Helos BTR Gen 2, whatever that one is. That one failed, died on the first drop, had a massive point of impact shift, had an internal shift of parallax to where the whole image was fuzzy at 10x, and that one there died twice in a row at the first drop. So that optic, well, there's many things that I like about it, not fantastically durable. The Arken EP-8 passed the first one, no issues whatsoever, and on the second harsher drop, of course, the mount died, so you do with that information as you will. Now, talking about value, I actually think that this is a fantastic value for a 1:8 34mm main tube first focal plane optic at about $375 to $400. I think the value proposition there is great. I think a lot of people being excited about it makes a lot of sense because it is one of the few scopes with that feature set, even with its slightly enhanced glass, because it is going to have a lot better glass, or not a lot better glass, but a little bit better glass than some of the other cheaper LPVOs on the market for only a little bit more money, a first focal plane reticle that actually works, good field of view, usability features, so on and so forth. There are a lot of things to like about it at about that $380 to $400. When you move up to the full asking price currently of $500, that's where it's not quite as exciting. Between about $500 and $800, maybe $850, somewhere in that range, is really a dead zone for LPVOs in my opinion. I don't really like any of the Primary Arms GLX LPVOs. I really like their SLX Gen 4s in terms of value, and of course their PLXC is fantastic for much more money. So between $500 and again $850, $900 is kind of a dead zone for LPVOs. So at $500, I think it's still technically a good value, if you need its feature set, of course, but it's not just exciting like it is at $380 to $400. At $380, I think it's a pretty fantastic deal currently. So while it's maybe not my personal favorite, that is a technical recommend and something that I do think provides a good value currently in the market. And again, if you're looking for this exact same feature set, but you really want better glass quality in a 1:8, you're probably looking at like the Trigicon Credo thingamajig, and that's much more. So in terms of value, it is a good value optic for sure. The performance is good. If you have this, you're not going to be outclassed by anything. It's not really going to hold you back in any way. It is, again, usable at every magnification level with a few compromises here and there. The size and weight is good. The durability, at least for my purposes, is perfectly fine. Keep in mind that RTT did drop this 3 times before I even got it, so it's been through quite a bit at this point and is still kicking. So with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the Arken EP-8 in the comments down below. If there's another optic that's better than it that I should compare it against. But once again, with all of that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.